Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at some really interesting research on how big global events, crises really, affect our connections.
Specifically, our sense of connection to different groups. Family, friends, neighbors, even bigger things like our country or humanity itself.
Exactly. And we've got this pretty significant study from Germany to guide us. They followed over 1,000 people during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah. And what's great is the sheer breadth of it. They didn't just look at close ties, but these wider social identities, too.
So our mission today, yours and ours, is to sort of unpack this. We want to understand what makes our sense of belonging shift when everything feels uncertain. Think of it as a shortcut to getting why we react the way we do.
It's a fascinating question.
Absolutely. And maybe you listening have noticed this in yourself, feeling, I don't know, pulled closer to certain people or maybe more distant from others during recent tough times. This deep dive should shed some light on that.
Okay, so the study itself, it was 2 online surveys, right? At different points during the pandemic in Germany.
Right. And what was the main headline? The big takeaway?
Well, the core finding is pretty striking. Overall, people actually reported feeling more connected, a stronger bond with all the social groups they studied.
All of them. So family, friends, neighbors, country, Europe, humanity, everything.
Yep, everything they measured. They looked at the average change in identification, and all the scores were above 0, meaning, on average, people felt closer.
Okay, but were there differences? Like, did some connections get a bigger boost than others?
Definitely. The biggest jump, by quite a margin actually, was identification with family.
That kind of makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? Leaning on immediate family during lockdowns and all that uncertainty.
Exactly. It likely rings true for a lot of people. That was the primary support system for many.
And where was the increase the smallest?
That was with neighbors. Identification with neighbors showed the least increase.
Maybe harder to connect when you're supposed to be keeping your distance.
Could be. Social distancing might have made those casual, close proximity, neighborly bonds a bit trickier to maintain or strengthen.
You know, this whole idea of feeling more connected during a crisis, it lines up with some existing theories in social psychology, right?
It really does. The researchers talk about the social identity approach and also uncertainty identity theory.
Okay.
The basic idea is that when we're facing big stressors, big uncertainties, our shared identities become more salient, more important. They sort of buffer us.
Like a psychological cushion.
Precisely. That feeling of we're in this together, whether it's with your family, your community, your nation, it provides comfort, a bit of predictability when the world feels chaotic. It helps manage the anxiety.
I remember that feeling early in the pandemic, suddenly feeling this shared experience with everyone else stuck at home.
That shared experience reinforces that collective identity. So yeah, these shared identities act almost like a psychological safety net.
Okay, that makes sense. But the study didn't just stop at if connections changed, right? They looked at why. They explored some individual differences.
Exactly. They wanted to see what predicts who strengthens their ties the most. And they started with something really fundamental, the need to belong.
That basic human drive, yeah. To connect, form relationships, avoid being lonely.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And what they found was quite clear. People who had a higher need to belong at the start of the study, well, they showed a significantly greater increase in identification with all the social groups later on.
All of them again. Wow. So if you're someone who really values connection, you are more likely to double down on those bonds across the board, family, friends, neighbors, country, humanity, when things felt unstable.
That's what the data suggests. It's like that need propelled them to seek out and reinforce those connections as a source of comfort and support.
Which implies that, maybe consciously nurturing your connections in general could build resilience for future crises.
It certainly points that way. And it also links up with pro-social behavior, helping others. People with a higher need to belong might be more motivated to both give and receive social support, which naturally strengthens group ties.
Okay, so the need to belong is a big piece of the puzzle. What else did they look at?
The next factor was perspective taking.
The ability to see things from someone else's point of view, understand their emotions, even if you don't agree.
Exactly that. While still holding on to your own perspective, of course.
I can see how that would be super important during a crisis. Lots of different reactions, opinions flying around.
Totally. And the finding here was also pretty consistent. Higher perspective-taking ability at the start was linked to a greater increase in identification with almost all the social groups.
Almost all. Okay, so which ones?
Family, friends, country, Europe, and humanity. So pretty broad again.
Interesting. So being empathetic, trying to understand others, might actually help us feel more connected to wider groups, not just our immediate circle, during tough times.
It seems that way. It perhaps fosters a sense of shared humanity or shared experience, even when dealing with very different circumstances or opinions. Maybe it helps bridge those divides.
You said almost all groups. What was the exception this time?
The link wasn't significant for neighbors after they applied stricter statistical controls.
Ah, neighbors again. And we already know that connections saw the smallest increase overall.
Right. So it seems perspective taking primarily boosted connections to family, friends, and those larger collectives. But yeah, being able to step into someone else's shoes seems beneficial for maintaining broader social harmony during crises. It's a key skill for navigating disagreements, too.
Definitely. Okay, now you mentioned something earlier that sounded unexpected about cognitive closure.
Ah, yes. The need for cognitive closure. This is basically the desire for clear, definite answers, a strong preference to avoid ambiguity and uncertainty.
Right. And my first thought, maybe yours too, would be that people high in this need would really cling to their groups during a crisis, seeking that certainty and structure.
That was exactly the hypothesis. It seems logical, doesn't it? Find certainty in the U.S. when the world is confusing.
Yeah. So what happened?
Well, surprisingly, the study found no significant link at all. A higher need for cognitive closure wasn't associated with changes in identification with any of the groups they looked at.
Wait, really? None. That completely goes against the intuition.
I know, it was quite the null finding.
Huh. Any ideas why? Did the researchers speculate?
They did suggest it might be more complicated. For instance, maybe it depends on how much agreement or disagreement there is within your group. If your family or friends have wildly different views on the crisis, someone needing closure might not actually find that certainty there anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So the group itself might not provide the clear answers they crave. That makes some sense.
So yeah, whether you're someone who needs things black and white or you're comfortable with shades of gray, it didn't seem to predict how your group connections shifted during this specific crisis, according to this study. A really fascinating wrinkle.
Definitely unexpected. Okay, so we've seen the overall trend and how need to belong and perspective taking play a role, while need for closure, surprisingly, doesn't seem to. Did they notice anything about how these patterns played out across different types of groups? Like close-knit versus broad categories?
Yes, that was another interesting observation. They essentially found similar patterns for both types of groups, meaning that the way individual differences like need to belong and perspective taking related to changes in identification was pretty consistent, whether they were looking at close groups like family and friends or these broader categories like country or humanity.
So the factors driving connection to family were kind of similar to those driving connection to, say, Europe.
In terms of how these individual differences related to the change in connection, yes. They found moderate to strong correlations between the changes in identification across these different group types.
Wow. That suggests there might be a more general tendency at play, doesn't it? How individuals approach social connections during stressful times.
Exactly. It hints that maybe some people just generally lean into social connections more during crises, regardless of the specific group, while others might do so less.
Sort of like a stable trait?
The researchers float that idea, yeah. They mention the possibility of trait-like aspects of social identification, suggesting there might be some consistency in how strongly we tend to identify with groups across different situations, especially stressful ones.
Okay, this has been a lot to unpack. Let's try and synthesize. What are the main takeaways for us, for the listener, from this deep dive?
Well, I think the first big one is that crises, despite the hardship, seem to have this effect of strengthening our social bonds overall, on average.
We tend to come together, in a way.
It seems so. And second, this strengthening effect appears particularly strong for people who have that high fundamental need to belong, and also for those who are good at perspective taking, at understanding others.
And the surprising counterpoint.
Right, the desire for clear-cut answers, that need for cognitive closure, it didn't really seem to move the needle much in terms of shifting group identification during this crisis.
It's a really powerful illustration of just how deeply social we are, especially when things get tough.
Absolutely. Now, it's important to mention the researchers themselves note that the effect sizes, while significant, were relatively small.
Meaning other factors are definitely involved.
Of course. Human behavior is always complex, influenced by countless things, but these factors need to belong. Perspective taking clearly play a discernible role.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. Reflecting on this, How might knowing about your own tendencies, your need for connection, how easily you take others' perspectives help you navigate future uncertainty? Could it help you maintain the connections that matter?
And perhaps think about which specific groups you feel most drawn to during challenging times. Is it family, friends, a broader community? And why might that be? It's definitely food for thought.